Ryan, and you are listening to Restitutio, a podcast that seeks to recover authentic Christianity and live it out today. In previous episodes, we've looked at Paul's church epistles and pastoral epistles. Today, we move into the third section of epistles in the New Testament, the general epistles. Instead of surveying each of the 8 general epistles, we'll just focus on 2, Hebrews and 1 John. We'll ask about author, audience, occasion, purpose, and mode for each. Going through these 2 will hopefully provide you with helpful examples to enable you to read these epistles more fruitfully on your own. Here now is episode 548, Read the Bible for Yourself, Part 15, How to Read the General Epistles. Number 15, How to Read the General Epistles. So the New Testament has 27 books in it, and we have looked at the first 5, which are historical, and then we looked at the middle 21, which are epistles, and we have church epistles and pastoral epistles, but we haven't looked at that last section yet. The last 8 epistles of that 21 is known as the general epistles. So that's what we're going to look at. Hebrews, James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Jude. What is a general epistle? So glad you asked. A general epistle is an epistle that is not written to a specific church or individual. So it's written to a general audience, and as a result, they're very easy to read, they're very applicable. And the word general, just in case you hadn't known this, in Latin is Catholicus, which is why they call these epistles, the last 8 of the New Testament, not including Revelation, that's why they call these the Catholic epistles. If you've ever seen that, some Bibles will use that language. It has nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church. It's just the word Catholic means universal, and the Roman Catholics picked that name because they are claiming to be the one universal church. But the word is lowercased when it means just the general epistles or general something or other. Now, I do have to mention right at the top that 2 and 3 John technically don't fit this definition. They are written to a specific individual each. So, but what are you going to do? It's a rough category, and generally these general epistles fit this general category. So we're just going to roll with that. My plan for today, I can't go through all 8 of these epistles with you. Actually, I could, but it would take several hours. And thankfully, these epistles, they work very much the same like the church epistles that we've already read and the pastoral epistles. You know, they're not wildly different. We're not talking about a whole new genre here. So this is a good opportunity for us to solidify what you've already learned about how to read and understand epistles. And so we're going to just look at Hebrews and 1 John. Those are the 2 that I want to look at. And really my goal here is not to explain to you Hebrews. That could be a whole class. Literally, it's 13 chapters. We could go one chapter at a time. Hebrews is an ocean of depth and rhetorical mastery. There's no way I could do it justice in half a teaching, okay? But that's not my goal. My goal is just to use Hebrews as an illustration for you of the principles we've been talking about in reading all these epistles, okay? And then we'll do the same thing for 1 John. And I picked these 2 because they're a little more challenging in certain regards than the other ones. So, all right, Hebrews. It's not always included among the general epistles. It's not really an epistle. I'm getting too technical. You have to forgive me. It's really a sermon. And that's okay, though, because a lot of the other epistles, especially the church epistles, are also pretty much sermons too. Except the church epistles will have that epistolary stuff in the beginning and at the end, and Hebrews doesn't seem to even have that. Hebrews just begins. There's no so-and-so to so-and-so, I thank God making remembrance of you in my prayer. None of that. Just right into the content. So think of Hebrews as a sermon. It'll well illustrate how the other general epistles work, even without some of the similar characteristics in the beginning and the end. So our plan is to look at authorship, audience, occasion, purpose, and mode. This is not information you know prior to reading an epistle. So what I'm telling you is, I'd rather you don't look up this sort of information in a study Bible or Wikipedia or Ask ChatGPT or whatever your AI you prefer. I'd rather that you read the epistle and have these as questions in your mind, something that you're looking for while you're reading. Who's the author? What's the audience? Why is he writing? What's the occasion for writing to these people? And so forth. By doing that, you keep your mind engaged. You ask these questions. And that's the first time through. First time through, be asking these questions. Then, your second time through, if you've made some progress on these, you'll be able to read it with so much more ease because you'll at least know the general goal of the writing. And it's not just tiny packets of information. It's yes, there are tiny packets of information called verses, right? But they're going somewhere like a river to a destination. So let's talk about authorship first. Who cares who wrote Hebrews? Well, you might ask yourself that question. I don't care. What do I care for? Why does it matter who wrote Hebrews? Well, it may matter or it might not matter. I mean, I think obviously if you believe in the inspiration of Scripture like I do, then what really matters is that God's behind it, right? But if the person who wrote Hebrews also wrote other books, that's relevant. You understand more background information that can inform your reading of Hebrews. So, for example, Luke wrote Luke and Acts. So it's helpful to have that in mind when you read the book of Acts, that this is actually a sequel by Luke, and if you've studied Luke, you know what are his style and his emphases and what he tends to focus on, and that can help you read Acts better. So that's one reason why authorship can matter. The big question for Hebrews, though, is not who wrote it. The big question is, did Paul write it? That's the question people ask about Hebrews. If Paul wrote it, then we know so much about Paul, and that can inform us how we read Hebrews. But if Paul didn't write it, then we need to look at this book independently. Now, the reasons for Pauline authorship, when I say Pauline, I mean relating to the Apostle Paul, not another lady friend named Pauline, okay? But it's a scholarly term that I just can't not use, so I'm going to just go ahead with it. So what are the reasons for Pauline authorship? Well, first off is this text here. Hebrews 13:23 says, I want you to know that our brother Timothy has been set free. And if he comes in time, he will be with me when I see you. Greet all your leaders and all the saints. Those from Italy send you greetings. Now, Paul is associated with Timothy. He was Timothy's mentor. And Paul, we know, had been transported to Italy by the Roman government and was standing trial in Italy, in Rome. So this could be an indication that Paul is the author of Hebrews. However, it's entirely possible that there is another person in the country of Italy that also knows Timothy. That's entirely possible, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that it's Paul. Let's say, for example, Priscilla, Luke, Titus. These are all people that know Paul and Timothy and travel to Italy, right? So it's not a definite to see these two facts here about Timothy and Italy. Now, Hebrews has Pauline themes in it, themes that you find in the church epistles and the pastoral epistles. So there is an emphasis on faith. Hebrews talks about Jesus as a mediator between God and humanity. It focuses on Christ's crucifixion as a sacrifice to redeem humanity. This is in Hebrews. Christ's superiority as the one God authorized and elevated to be the Lord. It also talks about the new covenant. This is something that Paul talks about in Corinthians as well. But there are also non-Pauline themes in Hebrews. So in Hebrews, we hear a lot about Christ as the high priest, and specifically, not just any high priest, but a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. This is totally foreign to Paul's epistles. There's a focus on the sacrificial system, the tabernacle, Levites, priests, and Aaron. In other words, the book of Leviticus is huge for understanding Hebrews. In fact, when I went to Bible college, there was a class called Leviticus and Hebrews. And that's what all the class was just looking at those two books side by side. Hebrews also talks about the heavenly sanctuary after which the one on earth is a copy. That's foreign to Paul's other epistles. It has a stronger emphasis on falling away and the need to hold fast. And it has elevated rhetorical eloquence. Now, that's not a theme. That's just an observation. And I don't think you can necessarily see this in English, but if you read this in the Greek, Hebrews is hard in a way that Paul's epistles are not hard. And just for the record, just like in English, the harder it is to understand your language, that means the better you are and more educated you are and more sophisticated you are, right? Hebrews Greek is pretty respectable. It's difficult. Whereas Paul's is like it's not just like talking on the street necessarily. I mean, he's got skill, he's got rhetorical skill, but not quite at the level of Hebrews. Now, that's not necessarily a deal breaker because you could use a different scribe and the scribe can have a say in the word choice, but it is something just to notice. An ancient Christian named Origen was born in 186 and died in 253, so a couple centuries after Christ. Origen wrote, he said, "The character of the language of the letter written to the Hebrews does not have the lack of refinement in speech characteristic of the Apostle Paul." What a backhanded compliment, you know. And just for the record, Origen is a total classicist. His Greek is impeccable. He was trained at the best schools. He trained under the leading philosopher of his time. Like he really knows the language. He was born into a Greek-speaking world, and he spoke Greek. So anyhow, he says, "The character of the language of the letter written to Hebrews does not have the lack of refinement in speech characteristic of the Apostle Paul, who confessed he was less refined in speech, that is, in his phrasing, but the letter is more Hellenizing," that means Greek, "in the arrangement of its language. All who know how to judge differences in phrasing would agree. The concepts are of the Apostle Paul, but the phrasing and the arrangement are those of someone who recollected the apostles' concepts, like someone who had taken notes on what his teacher said. If then any church has this letter as Paul's, let said church be approved in this. For it was not at random that the ancient men handed it down as Paul's, but who wrote the letter? God knows the truth. But the account that came to us is that some say that Clement, who was bishop of the Romans, wrote the letter, while others say that it was Luke who wrote the gospel and the Acts." So there's some ancient uncertainty about the authorship of the letter, and there's still good reason to think it probably wasn't Paul. So take a look at how Paul begins all of his other letters. Here are the 13 letters attributed to Paul. This is the first sentence of all those letters. Do you see a pattern? Every single one of them starts with the word Paul. He always says his name first, and then something about himself or those who are with him, and then he addresses whoever he's talking to the church at Colossae, to the church at Corinth, and so forth. So Paul. He calls himself an apostle a lot. Jesus Christ, or Christ Jesus, is always like right in that first breath with Paul. And how does the epistle of Hebrews start? Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, but in these last days, There is no Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ to the believer. Where is it? So it's not there. It is certainly unusual if Paul wrote it. Also, the author is not an eyewitness. And we know that from Hebrews 2, verse 3. How shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard. So the person or people who wrote Hebrews, they received it from those who heard. So Jesus is the original. Then there were those who heard, the original disciples and apostles and lady followers that were with Jesus in his ministry. And then there's another one downstream, and that's whoever it is writing this epistle. Paul did not talk like this. Paul claimed to be an eyewitness himself and to have received his gospel directly from Jesus Christ. And that's what he says in Galatians. So I don't think Paul wrote the Epistle of Hebrews. Most scholars, I don't want to say all, but very high percentage of scholars do not believe that, whether they're conservative or liberal. They generally don't think Paul wrote Hebrews. But Hebrews is Pauline. And what I mean by that is it was somebody associated with Paul that likely wrote it, okay? And so I like the idea of Barnabas. It could be anybody, nobody really knows. Daniel Wallace, who's a very famous scholar on the manuscripts of the New Testament, wrote a beautiful little intro on Hebrews. And in that he suggested that it's actually a plural authorship, because we do have these us's and we's in Hebrews that seems to be more than just the editorial we. And so he thinks maybe Barnabas wrote it and then Apollos helped him. Because we know that from Acts, Apollos was eloquent in speech. And we know that Barnabas was a Levite. And who better to inject and theorize and theologize and interpret the Christ event in light of the Levitical system than a Levite? So that's why I think Barnabas is a good theory. It's not really critical that you know the author of Hebrews, but if you know that it's not Paul, then you're not reading into it other ideas of Paul or other things that he said in other places. Whew, that was a tough one. That was hard. There are no other harder authorship questions in the general epistles than Hebrews, okay? Guess who wrote 1 Peter? Peter! Yes, it's so much easier, right? Who wrote Jude? Tom. No, just kidding. It's Jude. That's not a trick question. So, but Hebrews is a little bit difficult. Let's talk about audience. Let's move on to number 2. Think of Hebrews as a sermon. To whom is the author speaking? Who were the original recipients? And why is he speaking to them? What's the occasion? There are clues about the situation of who he's writing to, but he doesn't identify his audience in the beginning of the epistle, like we like. Instead, you have to wait pretty much till chapter 10. And in verse 32, you get this. But recall those earlier days when after you had been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to insults and afflictions, and sometimes becoming partners with those so treated. For you had compassion for those who were in prison, and you cheerfully accepted the plundering of your possessions, knowing that you yourselves possess something better and more lasting. Do not therefore abandon that boldness of yours. It brings a great reward. For you need endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. So what was going on? This is a group. They are Christians. We know that. That's a good starting place. These are Christians. You could argue that the Gospels are written for non-Christians because they're evangelistic to make them into Christians. Whereas Hebrews is definitely written to Christians. The audience seems to be Jewish, hence the name Hebrews. This is a book that is filled with Old Testament quotations. Over 70 Old Testament quotations and allusions. There's no mention or focus on the Gentiles. Like in most of Paul's epistles, there's this whole controversy about Gentiles. There's none of that here. It's like just focused on very Jewish themes. Levites and Aaron and the sacrificial system, those are distinctly Hebrew ideas and Jewish ideas. We know that these people had suffered persecution. It doesn't say that they're going through persecution now, because he says, remember the earlier days when after you have been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle. So these are people that have been persecuted, but there is a great anxiety. There's a great anxiety, and it comes throughout all the book of Hebrews, and it's expressed very nicely here in the verse we just read. It says, for you need endurance. So what does that tell you about these people? They're in jeopardy in some way. In some sense or another, there's a danger that they're going to fall away. Otherwise, you don't have to encourage them over and over again. You need endurance. You need endurance to do what? So that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. When it comes to the audience, Jewish Christians is the general understanding. The occasion, why did he write this? Somehow he found out that there's a danger. We don't know what the danger was. We just know that the epistle is full of warnings. And those warnings are to hold fast. Look at Hebrews 3:6. Christ, however, was faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house if we hold firm the boldness and the pride inspired by hope. Hebrews 4:14, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. Hebrews 10:23, let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. So there's a concern that these people are going to fall away. There are two texts in particular, Hebrews 6 and Hebrews 10, where he specifically warns them about falling away. And if you fall away, there's no bringing you back, is what he says in Hebrews 6 and in Hebrews 10, that if you willfully persist in sin, there's no longer a sacrifice for your sins. So, there's warning after warning after warning. And where is somebody going to go if they fall away from Christianity and they come from a Jewish background? Back to Judaism. They're going to go back to Judaism. Now, look, you have to realize for a moment that in the first century, and let's just imagine we're outside the land of Israel, we're in, the larger Roman Empire, the Jewish people were well established. They had a deal with the government of the Roman Empire that they did not have to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods or to the Roman Caesar. Why? Because in Jerusalem, they offered a sacrifice on behalf of Caesar. Not to Caesar, but on behalf of Caesar to Yahweh, to their God. So Jewish people had kind of an alliance, an understanding. And the Roman people, they could understand the Jewish people. They all had temples with sacrifices of animals. This was something that made sense to the Roman mind, it made sense to the Greek mind, it made sense to all the ancient minds. And so now here's this new group, and they came from Judaism, but they don't believe in sacrifices, and they think the sacrifice of Christ has done away with all the other sacrifices, and these guys are overwhelmingly poor and, kind of upstarts. And in the ancient world, to be a new religious movement was to be a false religious movement. Older was better. And so in our world, that's like almost the opposite. Give me the new thing. What's the newest thing? And, we even call our information about current events, we call it news, right? Because we just want what's new. And nobody wants last year's phone. You want this year? No, give me next year's phone. Let me have that, right? We're like that with technology, aren't we? So in the ancient world, at this time, the Jewish people would be meeting at the synagogue that would have beautiful stones. And it would have beautiful murals. And it would look nice, and it was respectable. And the people that were attending there had influence in the city. And then the Christians are meeting in some dumpy storefronts with folding chairs. And people are overwhelmingly slaves or low status. And maybe there'll be a couple of higher ranking people there in the back or something, right? Just imagine that contrast. Now, they didn't, I don't think, have folding chairs in the storefronts like we do. But just as an analogy, think of that. And think of the lure that if you're sitting there in somebody's house and you're under threat because you don't have an established agreement with the governor and the society, how nice would it be to just go to the big mega church of this synagogue and be protected? And so there was a pull in that direction, even if there wasn't persecution, but persecution did flare up from time to time. And the danger here that I see throughout Hebrews, and you will see this if you look for yourself, the danger, the fear is that these people are going to forsake Christ. It doesn't say they're going to forsake God, doesn't say they're going to go worship the idols, but they're going to forsake Christ and probably return to Judaism. So, what's the purpose of the epistle of the Hebrews? Well, this will be quick. Convince these persecuted Jewish Christians, or I should maybe say pressured Jewish Christians, to hold fast to their faith in the Messiah Jesus. Convince them to stay Christian. And then mode. Mode is answering the question, how is this epistle going about accomplishing its purpose? That is simply summed up in one word. better. Let me show you. The idea is that Christianity is better than Judaism. Chapter 1 of Hebrews. Jesus, as God's promised Messiah, is better than the angels who gave the law. Chapter 2, Jesus' salvation is better because he is human. Chapter 3, Jesus is better than Moses. Chapter 7, Jesus' priesthood is better than Aaron's. Chapter 8, Jesus' covenant is better than the old covenant because it has better promises. Chapter 9, Jesus' heavenly priestly service is better than the priest serving at the temple on earth. Chapter 10, Jesus' sacrifice is better than animal sacrifices. Chapter 11, the unshakable Mount Zion covenant is better than the covenant at Mount Sinai. Overall, the rhetorical effect is to ask, why in the world would Christ followers want to downgrade to Judaism after they've tasted something so much better? That's where Hebrews is heading. And if you understand that after your first reading through, you read through it again, you'll be like, oh, I get why he's doing this weird argument about the promises of the covenant are better. And he quotes, it's the longest quote in the entire New Testament of the Old Testament, in Hebrews chapter 8. And he says like half a sentence, and then he moves on. And what does he do? He quotes the New Covenant prophecy from Jeremiah in full, and then he says, because he says New Covenant, the Old Covenant is obsolete. And then he moves on. And the rhetorical effect is that if you're the one hearing this, you're like, well, I know the synagogue's really nice, but like if it's obsolete, do I really want to go there? Maybe I should just stick with my Christian identity, my Christian friends. So that's kind of the effect of the whole thing. By learning and figuring out and asking yourself the questions while you read, who's the author, who's the audience, what's the purpose, what's the occasion, what's the purpose, what's the mode, you can still feel like you're rafting in the middle of an unfamiliar river, but at least you know where it's going. There's still going to be parts where you're going to be like, I don't know what this is talking about. That's okay. You figure that out with time. This is a big book, the Bible, and it takes time to learn and grow in it. All right, let me go through 1 John, obviously much quicker because we used a lot of time on Hebrews there. So who's the author of 1 John? Well, most people would say John, but if you ask me the question, well, why do you think it's John? I'd have to look at verse 1 on the authorship question. And verse 1 says, we declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. I don't see the word John there. Fair point. Fair point. The reason why we know that John wrote 1 John is not because of what 1 John says, or 2 John or 3 John. It's because later Christians, who were the ones that copied these things and handed them down and protected them, they all identify this letter as written by John. So the letter itself is technically anonymous. But this is also probably something to do with their scrolls, because this is before the Codex. These would be individually rolled scrolls. And on the outside, you would write the name of the document, and then on the inside, you'd have the actual contents. And the contents would be protected because they'd be on the inside of the roll, but what was on the outside was not protected. It was just, exposed to the elements. And so the earliest copies we have don't have the little part that says the name of it. It just has the text, okay? So some people have questioned, well, is it really written by John? Look, it's possible it wasn't written by John, but the general consensus among the earliest Christians who talk about this, including Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and the Muratorian canon, all associate the Apostle John with 1 John, okay? So, I think that's good enough for me. That 1 John was written by the same person that wrote the Gospel of John is without question. Like, you just can't even doubt it. Because the vocabulary and the style are very similar, like identical. And not to say there's no variation, but if you read the Gospel of John and then you read 1 John, you'll see there's just too much similarity to deny that. All right, so let's just go with that. Let's just go with John as the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee. And let's talk about the next question, which is audience. For 1 John, which is a fairly short book, I think it's just 5 chapters, audience is actually difficult. It's not very easy to figure out. There's little to no information about his audience. We know they were Christians, and we know John's worried about them. But what was going on in their lives, where they lived, we have no idea. And you know what? That's just the way it is sometimes. This is a harder one again. That's why I picked it, to show you this. So we don't have that much about the audience, but we know something about the occasion. Here's the occasion. Why did John write this letter? There's a group of rogue Christians. And he says about them, they went out from us, but they did not belong to us. And he says they are trying to deceive everyday Christians. And there are many false prophets who have gone out. And they are denying that Jesus is the Christ. And they may have been teaching that sin is okay. You'll get that impression from reading the epistle that he's saying that this other group is teaching this because he comes against that so much. So he's writing to Christians in general. He's warning them of these rogue Christians who are teaching these new ideas, and that is his occasion. His purpose is to equip the readers of this book or the hearers of this book to discern who the false Christians are and to avoid their false teachings. How does he do it? Well, that was the purpose. How does he do it? That's the mode. How does John go about accomplishing his purpose? He focuses on 2 things, Christology and behavior. When I say Christology, I mean your beliefs about Jesus. Okay, or your beliefs about Christ. Your logos about Christos. This is what he says. Chapter 4, verse 2, whoever confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. In chapter 4, verse 14, he says, testify that the Father has sent his Son as the Savior of the world. In 4, verse 15, he says, confess that Jesus is the Son of God. In 5:1, believe that Jesus is the Christ. In 5:5, believe that Jesus is the Son of God. In 5:10, believe in the Son of God. In 5:11, life is in his Son. In 5:13, believe in the name of the Son of God. What are they teaching? What is this other group teaching? Well, one of the things they're teaching is that Jesus did not come in the flesh. This is an idea, you probably are not familiar with it unless you've done church history, but this is an idea called docetism, from the Greek word dokeo, which means to seem or appear. And it's the idea that Jesus appeared human, but he wasn't human. And it was an idea that was starting to gain traction in the time of the writing of this epistle, and it would flourish in the 2nd century and give birth to a whole movement called the Gnostics, and they had all kind of complicated branches within their own general approach to Christianity. But this idea was already somehow around, and he's saying, look, you have to believe Jesus has come in the flesh, and you have to believe that he's the Savior of the world. The Gnostics would later teach that the goal is to escape the world because the world is evil. That's not a Christian teaching. And you have to confess that Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is not just some rando aeon from a higher realm that came down. No, he's the Son of God. He has a much elevated role and identity and authority than just an angel or what they would call aeons in the later development of this idea. And you have to believe that Jesus is the Christ. Christ means Messiah, means King, one to rule the world. And again, Son of God, Son of God, Son of God. So this is obviously something that he's sort of just banging this drum. And so he's trying to get them to not fall into these strange new teachings about Jesus. Before I move on. So in other words, if you encounter a Christian in a church service, or maybe they're talking to you afterwards and they're like, I just wanted to let you know that there's a whole other way to look at this. And they start telling you about how Jesus just appeared to be human, but he really wasn't. Now, you're sensitized to it, you're warned about it, you're not going to fall for that. You're going to say, look, you're one of these rogue Christians that the apostle warned us about, that we're not going down this road with you. You see how the effect of it would be to do that? And then the other is behavior. A lot of focus on behavior in 1 John. This is 1 John 3:7. It says, "Little children, let no one deceive you." I wonder if there's a concern that people might get deceived. "Everyone who does what is right is righteous, just as he," presumably Jesus, "is righteous. Everyone who commits sin is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The Son of God was revealed for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. Those who have been born of God do not sin, because God's seed abides in them. They cannot sin because they have been born of God. The children of God and the children of the devil are revealed in this way. All who do not do what is right are not from God, nor are those who do not love a brother or sister." This is a very simple message in very simple language, but just like in the Gospel of John, simple language, profound ideas. What he's saying to them is that righteousness matters. If you're with God, you're doing things God's way. And if you don't care about sin, then you're of the devil, and you're just embracing the teachings of the devil. It's black and white. It's overemphasized to make it clear. And when he says they cannot sin because they have been born of God, people today coming across this, not understanding the situation that's going on in the book of 1 John, they ask the question, is this the doctrine of perfectionism? And there are actual Christian movements, and at least one denomination or two I can think of off the top of my head, who have interpreted it this way and have said that if you have a lustful thought, you're not a real Christian. If you lie even once, you're not a real Christian. If you struggle with anger or some other sin, you're not a real Christian, because Christians do not sin and cannot sin. That's the doctrine of perfectionism. So this is why it's so important to read within the letter's context, to understand the author, the audience, the occasion, the purpose, the mode, these kinds of things. Even if you don't figure out all those things independently, just getting a sense of like what's going on then before asking the question, what does that mean to me now? I haven't been focusing on what does it mean to you now. That's important, and you should do that. You should always do that. But I feel like we're always doing that automatically, so I haven't been focusing on it. In the ZIBBC, they write about this. They say, it is unlikely that John has in mind absolute sinless perfection, since earlier he has denounced those who say they are without sin, chapter 1, verse 8 and verse 10. Rather, John has in mind the blatant sinning to which those who have left the community have fallen prey. In view of the letter as a whole, such sinning probably involves denial of Christ's human nature, flaunting of God's commands, a failure to love, or some combination of these grave errors. This is reading 1 John well. This is a good example of a scholar who's reading it well and saying, John's not asking you to never sin or else you're not a real Christian. What he's saying is, if you're okay with sin, then you've probably been influenced by this rogue group of Christians, and you're in serious danger, and you're going in the path of the devil. So it's oversimplified and it's contextualized, and if you read it in that context, then it makes sense what he's doing. But if you just like lift that one verse out of nowhere and say, oh, Christians can't sin, I must not be a Christian. I could sin. And that is problematic. He also offers many appeals to live righteously, live differently than the world, and love your brother or sister in Christ, which may indicate that this other group was teaching you don't have to live righteously. You can be the same as the world, and you don't need to love. We can't know that for sure, but these are emphases in the book of 1 John. Let's review. General epistles are for Christians in general rather than a specific church or person. In order to understand the general epistles, it's helpful to figure out authorship, audience, occasion, purpose, and mode. I should add, it's also helpful to figure out date. Date is a whole other can of worms that scholars fuss about. And in my experience, it doesn't matter that much, okay? So I feel like I already pushed it a little bit with authorship, adding that to the list. So I didn't want to press it too hard with date. But that's another thing that you can look for while you go. And for that, you would have to know other stuff outside the Bible, obviously, to date things. Authorship is explicit for James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and Jude. But take some work to figure out for Hebrews and 1 to 3 John. If you look at any of these other epistles, the first words are usually James to so-and-so, or Peter to so, or Jude to so-and-so. That's why I picked the ones I did. Hebrews was probably not written by Paul, but by someone who spent time with him, like Priscilla, Luke, Barnabas, or Apollos. Or it could be Frank. Who knows? I don't know if they had Franks in their time, but it could just be somebody we don't know the name of that person, right? Audience and occasion are often intertwined and determinable by gleaning bits of historical information from the epistles themselves. As you read, ask yourself, who was the original audience and what was going on with them? To discern the purpose, ask, what is the author's main goal in this epistle? Mode is answering the question, how does the author go about achieving his purpose? Once you've figured out the author, audience, occasion, purpose, and mode, understanding the rest of the epistle's particulars is much easier. Well, I hope you found this 3-part series on the epistles helpful. A lot of what I just covered here applies to what we've already looked at, and these can be, let's face it, the most complicated parts of the New Testament, where there's a lot of difficulty in understanding what's really going on, but probably not the most difficult. We save that for next time. That would have to be the book of Revelation, and we'll look at that as we continue through our class on how to read the Bible.
Well, that brings this episode to an end. What did you think? Come on over to restitutio.org and find episode 548, How to Read the General Epistles, and leave your feedback there. Well, friends, I made it back from Turkey and Greece. Went on a 2-week trip with Jerry Wirrell and the organization he hired called Pilgrim Tours. And we visited 15 sites in Turkey and then 14 sites in Greece. Got to go to many biblical places, many that I've never been to before, and some sites that are relevant for church history as well. We ended up going to all 7 of the churches mentioned in the book of Revelation. We also visited many of the places that the Apostle Paul went, including Troas, Miletus, Ephesus, Corinth, Athens, Berea, Amphipolis, Philippi, Thessalonica, and others as well. And it was an eye-opening experience. I mean, I've been to a number of these sites before. We also went to historical sites that are not mentioned in the Bible, such as Istanbul, got to see Hagia Sophia, or as they call it, Hagia Sophia, the church that Justinian built in 537, still standing. Unbelievable. And many other Greek churches along the way, as well as other historical sites like the tomb of Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, a recent discovery, and other unusual places like Meteora and Hierapolis. And it was just so incredible because when I came back, I made it back just a few days ago, last Saturday. It took me a few days to adjust to the time change and everything, but I was reading the scriptures in the book of Acts on Wednesday, which is from the time of this recording, just yesterday. I was just reading through a little section of Acts, and it was listing off these different place names, and I was just thinking to myself, it's amazing how a list of place names can seem so relevant when you've never been there. But then when you have been there, it's just totally different. It's just totally different. And it's like the Bible, especially like the book of Acts and parts of the Bible that reference these different places, like certain epistles of the Apostle Paul, it's like reading a pop-up book now rather than a flat book. And so I highly recommend to you, if you can get over to Israel, to Greece, to Turkey, you definitely should go. Something that I had noticed a little bit in the past, but noticed much clearer this trip was just how amazing the sites in Turkey are. Now that I've been to the Greek sites, I had been to the Parthenon in Athens, but not a lot of other places in Athens or in Greece in general. And those sites are decent, but they just don't compare to the Turkish sites. Western Turkey is a safe and fantastic place to travel to. The people are nice, the weather is good, the food is good, and the archaeological sites will blow your mind, especially Ephesus, Hierapolis, Laodicea, but also some others that I don't want to just list off a bunch of names here. So anyhow, I highly recommend to you that if you are inclined to do it, that you do go. There are tours always going to the places mentioned in the Bible. I'm not sure how many people are going to Israel right now, considering that Israel is at war. But I would hope that in the years to come that will clear up. So anyhow, I highly recommend going. I know I've said it before, I'm kind of a broken record, but I'm just so determined to do my part to change our culture from this like electronic only and hey, I saw it on my phone, so I feel like I know it, to actually going there, developing a pilgrimage mentality, because when you go, you experience it, trust me, it's way better than just watching a video or looking at pictures or reading a commentary about different places that the Bible mentions. So it was awesome. I will be sharing about my trip on at church on Sunday. Actually, after our regular service, we'll have a lunch, and Jerry and I will both do a sharing. And that hopefully will turn into a YouTube video, and I'll go ahead and post that in the Facebook group if any of you are interested in seeing that, and potentially also on the website, depends on how motivated I am. But that will give you a chance to see a little bit of what we saw, and let me just tell you, it was so worth it. So I encourage you, if you do get the opportunity in the future, to check out the Bible lands. These are real places that you can go, and that really help you read the scriptures with more clarity, and I think take your faith to the next level. Like I had this really interesting moment, couple different moments, but one was at the tomb of Philip the evangelist, which is in Hierapolis, and just thinking to myself, like, this guy, he was an evangelist, and he had these daughters, and they were prophetesses, and what a stand he took. And he was, did all this exciting stuff in Samaria that everybody talks about in chapter 8 of Acts. But like then he lived his life too, and he was a faithful evangelist, and he got to tell people about Jesus, and he stood his whole life long. And here's his tomb, just really cool to see. And then another experience I had was at the river outside of Philippi, where Paul preached to Lydia, and then after she believed, she was baptized, and it's just like, wow, this is that spot where that happened, or at least nearby. They don't know exactly where it happened, but obviously the river, they know where the river is. And this is that river, this is that water, this is that place where Christianity came to Europe in the first place. And so it was really cool. Thanks to those of you who had me in your prayers. I want to mention that as well, because we did not have any kind of troubles with travel or with any locals, or when we were in the Muslim country, no difficulties on account of religion. I did deal with a pushy nun in a Greek convent, but that's another story for another day. But so anyhow, thanks if you were praying for our team, and God was with us, and we made it back safely. Well, that's going to be it for today. I'm looking forward to next week, where we're going to just take a deep dive into Revelation. There was no way for me to chunk Revelation in with any other book of the Bible. It just is its own thing. I mean, maybe Zechariah, you could do it, but or Daniel to some degree. But it just felt right to handle it alone. And so we're going to do that next week. And then I've got a couple more episodes after that, one on translation and one on helpful tools. And then we'll be done with this Bible series. I've had a little bit of feedback on this class, not as much as previous classes, but I think that's pretty much to be expected. I think a lot of people are under the impression that they are quite able to read the Bible and understand it for themselves. I get it. This is not really advanced material. This is like more the basics. But you know what? It's important, and I really kind of felt like I should do it, so I am doing it. And I really think this is the sort of material that if you do know any friends or family members who are just like coming to Christianity for the first time, or are maybe grew up Christian but are just now like starting to take the Bible seriously, and it's just a really complicated book and it's confusing, give them this class, whether the video version on YouTube or this audio version on the Restitutio podcast, because I think it really can help people, especially if you can have this class early in your Christian journey. It can help you reading the Bible for many years to come more profitably than if you just sort of feel your way through the darkness without having any kind of light to lead you. So hopefully it'll serve that purpose. That's going to be it for this week. If you'd like to support this ministry, you can do that at restitutio.org. I'll catch you next week. And remember, the truth has nothing to fear.